Hello guys, it's Chumster here doing another Bakugan video. This time, we're going to talk about Bakugan BakuTech stats. So, first up, apologies if this video looks a little bit weird. This is my first time testing out this new setup for Bakugan, and Bakugan requires its own special setup within the setup, so sorry if it's a little awkward. Anyway, BakuTech stats were interesting. So, basically, on the box, you'd see these stats, and it'd be like a pentagon. Certain stats are better than others, they point to different areas. It is what it is. Anyway, I'm here to talk about these stats because they are kind of, listed. They are talked about a little bit on, like, the wiki, and just in general on the box, because, again, they're there, so I kind of want to talk about them, why they don't exist anymore, well, why they didn't exist past, BakuTech. They were not in BakuTech Gachi, actually. They stopped that, and, why I think that was probably for the best, and just after that we'll talk about the actual stats, some of the best Bakugan in said stats and whatnot, but anyway. First up, I want to discredit the actual stats themselves. What I mean by that is, basically, you would never see a single Bakugan that had a stat below 4. 4 was already pretty uncommon, but 5, 6, 7, 8 were the main stats you'd see, the main numbers you'd see, so even if something was worthless in a set, they'd still get like a 4 or 5 for whatever reason. 9s were pretty uncommon, and then 10s were very uncommon. There were only ever 3 10s given out. One of them was for attack, and a second was for defense, both for size tabinal, which is, for the time, sure. However, the other 10 was another 10 in defense. For Grand Panzer. They gave Grand Panzer a 10 in defense. I think that's grounds to just discredit the entire stat system as is. The stats didn't really make a whole lot of sense, to be honest. A lot of them felt pretty arbitrary, and also, again, when you don't really want to go below 5 often, and you never go below 4, it's a little bit disingenuous, especially with some Bakugan like MacLeod existing and not going below 4 in any stat. How did that happen? So I don't think the stats themselves are very good, but I still want to talk about them because, again, I think it's at least an interesting topic. Now, shifting gears, we'll get into our first actual stat, and that is going to be attack, with an asterisk. So what I mean by this is, we're talking about attack, but specifically closed attack. What do I mean by closed attack? Basically, how good is a Bakugan, attacking in ball form. Basically, this just comes down to weight, Can a Bakugan kind of just slam into another Bakugan, maybe go flying, stuff like that. Can just kind of bully its way into a card, right, and get a crit KO or a KO or whatever. This is how I'm writing attack. I will talk about this in a moment to why I'm doing this and making this distinction, but as far as attack goes, it's an interesting stat, because, again, you kind of want to bully your way into, a card. However, there's the other side of attack, and this gets us into our second stat. So our second stat is stand. That's it. Also sometimes called stand force. This stat is an absolute nightmare. So I've gone through, and some smaller Bakugan that don't have parts that, really flare out that much are pretty low in stand, and others are, with parts flaring out more, are higher in stand. But then you get to things like Kachigel and Budagil, which are low in stand, which makes no sense because they should have high pop-out force, and then things like Twin Dobru are high in stand, and I don't know what they were going for, but when you consider something like Twin Dobru has 2 magnets, I think they were actually trying to play off this idea of stand being a stat of how well does a Bakugan stand, which is incredibly stupid, by the way. That makes zero sense. That is a completely arbitrary stat that means, like, nothing for almost every Bakugan out there. This is a really stupid stat, if that's what they were going for. Otherwise, they just messed up badly, I guess, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to be talking about stand as if it was pop-out force, so how many parts kind of just flare out, like Gogaryu here has its head that has a stronger spring, stuff like that. That's how I'm going to be talking about this stand stat, because otherwise I feel like it is terrible and makes absolutely no sense and is completely arbitrary and makes it even worse. So, talking about stats for this video, I'm going to be rating it like that because again, otherwise we have an arbitrary stat, and I'll talk about why that's such a problem later, so with our last stat, the fifth one, that'll be interesting. Now our next stat is defense. Defense is pretty self-explanatory. It's how well does a Bakugan, you know, stay on the card and not go flying, and that's a pretty simple one. There's nothing else crazy for these stats. I don't have to make a weird divide or argument for why I'm rating a stat the way it is. It just kind of exists, and that's really all there is to it. Our next stat is occupancy. Occupancy, well, yeah, it's this. It's how big is a Bakugan? How much of the card does it occupy? Again, I think that one is fairly self-explanatory. You know, it just works. I do think the divide between defense and occupancy is interesting. I'll talk about this later, but, I mean, the stat itself, at least, you know, makes sense. And now for our final stat, which is control. Control is basically just, you know, how well does a Bakugan roll? Does it have any interesting rolling gimmicks? You know, does it control better or worse? It's, I feel in a lot of ways, kind of a specific or arbitrary stat, but there are Bakugan that do legitimately use it. Again, convert system could have an impact on this. Something like Made Last Boss here has a pretty interesting rolling style, you know, having its different, you know, 8 modes. I think that this stat makes sense, but this is why I'm rating the stand stat the way I am, because I feel like control should probably have that accounted for. You know, if you're controlling a Bakugan, I feel like, you know, its ability to stand should be accounted for within its control, which is why I'm making the distinction and borderline replacing one of the stats here, because it's just so stupid otherwise. Anyway, control, again, it's pretty self-explanatory, but at the same time it's a little bit weird because I feel like there aren't many specific cases of it, but things like, you know, Zero Municus, Made Last Boss, Borg Mimesis, Kalugan, things like that, I think, you know, can have higher control stats because of their interesting movement. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of these stats individually. So first up we have attack. Again, just kind of closed attack. Again, you really care about weight here, things like, you know, well, actually Made Last Boss, while it is, you know, good for control, I mean, you don't have to be limited to, you know, one stat, but that can also be a good, like, closed attacker. Obviously, you know, Sextavinal, Size-Tavinal, they're heavy. Things with 4 metal pieces, you know, Grandragon, there's Zero Municus, those can be good as well. But Sansu Halibos is definitely the best in terms of weight. There's a pretty notable gap between the Tavinals and the third heaviest Bakugan, and then there's an even bigger gap between Sansu Halibos and the Tavinals, so, you know. Anyway, the other thing that you can look out for with kind of this, you know, close attack is actually balance. What I mean by that is something like G Ganorada. G Ganorada has its gravity ring. It just has 2, you know, cross pieces up here. So normally this wouldn't be as good, but because these cross pieces are centered as well as they are, you know, the gravity ring, it just works well as an attacker because, you know, when it opens up, it just plants, which I wouldn't consider, you know, stand force based on my own, you know, rankings here, because that would imply it had pop-out force, but, yeah, it doesn't really do that. It's mainly just you can kind of fling this Bakugan and it should just plant itself and stand, and that helps, which, in some ways you could argue should be like the closest thing we actually have to stand force, in the way that I kind of interpreted it from the rankings, but this thing has a low stand force. Again, that rating doesn't make sense. It just doesn't, which is why I'm, you know, kind of replacing it, because it doesn't work. But yeah, this one, it's good for close attack because it has a gimmick that, you know, allows it to be centered, but also plant itself, opens properly. Works well for crit KOs, so I think that works very, very well. So, definitely a good Bakugan in that regard. And now we get to the quote-unquote stand stat, which, again, I'm just qualifying as pop-out force. So, there's good, you know, Bakugan for this. Things that, you know, like Rise Dragon opens up, you know, pretty large, which is nice. Stuff like that, you know, is always good. But, Gogari, this thing opens up, I mean, like, it's pretty, you know, large. Got these metal blades, a lot of metal here. But also, you know, you got this part here. aside from having a strong spring in the head, it just opens up to be pretty large, which I think, yeah, this thing has a really, really good pop-out force. Just as a whole, I'd say it's probably arguably the best in the game. So yeah. Now, there are some other Bakugan that do qualify for this. First up, we have Kachiagel. I mean, this one, it's not as crazy as Gogaryu, but the head spring is crazier than Gogaryu's head spring, because that thing is powerful, so you got that. You also have something like Buddha Gill. Buddha Gill, you can curve shot this, and you got the neck, the tail, strong springs, so that is pretty nice. And also, this one's interesting, but you have Nino de Shao. So this one, unfortunately, is kind of a 50-50. You can manipulate magnet positioning to get this, side you want more often than others, but this whole thing, when you land on the correct side, it basically, jumps off the card and just goes, directly at an opponent, and that definitely qualifies as good pop-out force, because it literally has so much force when it opens, it jumps, so yeah, it definitely does qualify as one of the best in that regard. Now, one other thing to note is kind of hybrid attack. This kind of goes back to the attack stat as it was sort of originally presented from what I interpreted, so I think something like Gogaryu probably works the best, because it is fairly heavy. You got 4 metal parts here. It can definitely blow some things, but also opens up to be, fairly large. You got this, stronger than average spring. I think this thing does really well at both. Just kind of that close attack, but also pop-up force. That said, you don't necessarily need a hybrid attacker, that does both things pretty well. You can really just focus on weight, pop-up force, although Gogaryu is arguably the best attacker in the game anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But, I personally prefer Sanzo Halbos slightly, but that might be a little bit more of an unpopular take for competitive. But yeah, you can kind of just get away with whatever you want with attack, honestly. As long as it's either, really heavy or good with really nice distribution, or an additional gimmick like G Generata, or just has good pop-up force. Even things like Grendragon could work. Has 4 metal pieces, slightly better than average pop-up force. That could work as well. But I think hybrid attack is just overall Gogaryu is probably the best, because again, it's decently heavy with its 4 metal blades, plus I got the metal horn, and really, really good pop-up force. So while I did qualify it for, the category of pop-out force, I still think overall it does work pretty well as a hybrid attacker, but we'll have a bit of a more interesting time when we talk about hybrid defense when we get to that whole mess, because that will be, I think that'll be a pretty fun topic. Now, moving on to defense, we have Jaiba Fudo is, really the best defensive Bakugan. So one thing about defense that I think is very notable is that you really don't need defense that much. I think there's 2 Bakugan that really get away with it. There are things like, Ogre Leonis or Shield Leonis that are good defensively and can be used, but I wouldn't call them top tier. There's only one proper top tier defensive Bakugan, which is, Jaiba Fudo, and then a second one that's debatable. But here's the thing about defense, is it doesn't actually matter how well a Bakugan can stand the card if you don't have the occupancy to back it up. You need a level of occupancy to back up defense, and Jaiba Fudo is not really large by any means, but the fact that, its width at least covers, the card pretty well, and it has a second magnet, so, it backs up, it's hard to move. I'm obviously pushing it, but, it's showing more resistance than any other Bakugan would, right? The only other Bakugan that I'd really say is a good defensive Bakugan, a really good defensive Bakugan, is Bury Beyond. This is a weird case because it has kind of the occupancy thing to where it just blocks part of the card, but it's not big either. It's just that it defends one side of the card really well, and that does work pretty well for Bury Beyond, so you know what, sure, why not? It works as a good defensive Bakugan, so... And again, it kind of pairs with occupancy in a way, but kind of in a weird way, so... It's kind of hybrid between defense and occupancy, but also it isn't, and it's just defense. It's a weird situation, but it's the second best defensive Bakugan in that sense, I would say, so... It's a weird case, though. And now we have occupancy. Occupancy, of course, the original was, Acro Gezer, the original long Bakugan. The whole thing about occupancy is it takes up a lot of the card. We saw the Bakugan kind of replicate, Acro Desert, but I'd argue better. You have things like Yonja 4, which is pretty similar, but has extra utility with its other modes. Press, which gives you a level of attack, actually, with the rubber band, but also it's like a top-tier occupancy Bakugan, let's be honest. This rubber band here as well, a little bit of extra defense on it, and then Nagadaja, which is just kind of, like, again, it's really just a massive Bakugan, so... Occupancy is weird because it inherently kind of has defense built in. And that's the thing, because I had a whole category about, like, hybrid defense, and how that's supposed to work, if you kind of merge defense and occupancy together, but I feel like occupancy, when it's high enough, like these Bakugan that I just showed, and there's other things like, like Daifujo, for example, but, when occupancy is this high, and it covers a lot of the card, I feel like you kind of just have defense built in. Nagadaja, this Bakugan is incredibly difficult to crit KO. And that's largely just because it's very low to the ground, as these Bakugan are, and it's big. So you kind of get defense out of that in a sense as well. Which is why I generally prefer occupancy Bakugan to kind of pure defense Bakugan. Something like Barry Beyond is something I wouldn't quite consider top tier personally, but it's close. Because it, it does block her pretty well, which kind of steals from occupancy in some ways, but something like Jaibafudo, it only gets worth it because its defense is just so absolutely absurd that, yeah, its lackluster occupancy isn't a problem, and even then, its occupancy isn't terrible, because if it was like G-Gan or out of size, yeah, it'd be bad, because it would be easy to get around. But when you have good occupancy, it doesn't really matter nearly as much, because, well, again, you kind of just take up a lot of the card, you're hard hit off. You get defense and occupancy with an occupancy Bakugan, which is why I think the stat is kind of just better than defense, personally. Again, unless you're Jaibafudo and you just have such a crazy defense stat with at least enough occupancy to back it up. But, yeah, occupancy is probably another one of the weirder stats here, because I feel like it, in a lot of ways, it outclasses or even just kind of absorbs defense, so yeah. And for our final stat, we have, of course, control. So... Control's interesting. There are things, like Curve Shot Bakugan, like the entire Municus line. That would, in my opinion, count as control. There's also things like, Van Falco, really the whole Falco line, which, I know, like, Van Falco has this, like, trick shot thing going on, and Trifalco has the weird bump, which is, you could argue is either good or bad for control, depending on how you want to use that, but, LeChat Falco also has its whole airflow thing to be, like, fast, which is stupid, but you could at least argue that's higher control, but Made Last Boss, this thing, of course, has, its 8 different modes, which the metal piece up here offsets, differently, and, I mean, that has to count for control, right? So, that, I mean, of course, makes sense. Also, things like Bortmesis or Kalukin. I have Kalukin right here. The thing about Kalukin is when you close it, the wing here, as you can see, the cross part is diagonal, so if you have that with, if you want to open back up, that'd be helpful, but I guess not. Anyway, yeah, if you want this part, there we go. I think it was just stuck on the thing. Anyway, if you put metal on, like, diagonal cross parts, which are only on, this Bakugan or Bortmesis, then yeah, it kind of rolls differently. So, control, it's definitely not a very interesting stat, I would say, but, I mean, it has an impact. It's, again, not really interesting. These things, unless if you want them to, they're meant to roll, like, straight as long as you know what you're doing. Again, you could change up metal distribution, which I'd argue, alright, that can be like a control thing, but, yeah, it's not exactly that interesting of a stat, unfortunately. It kind of just exists, if we're being honest, and I did not open this manual part back up. There you go. Anyhow. So one last thing I want to touch on for this video is hybrid Bakugan. What I mean is basically just Bakugan that are meant to be like a mix of stats. They can have attack and defense. They're meant to kind of do everything or kind of combine stats that you would normally see. Again, control can just be applied to whatever, but like attack and defense together or something, How does that work? Cyanoquis is really like the first big example of this being a fairly large Bakugan. Papa Force is but it's lower to the ground, has, 2 soul pieces that are metal, 2 cross pieces that can be metal, and they're at least fairly low to the ground overall, so decent defense and good solid occupancy and attack. Well, you have 4 metal pieces, which is pretty nice, and yeah. I think Hyper Bakugan just struggle because generally you want things that actually like max the potential of your specific stat. Again, it kind of boils down to attack as a whole or defense, which largely just means occupancy if we're being honest, but you know, it is what it is. So something like St. Aquis still works pretty well, I would say, because it's at least solid enough overall. It can really just be kind of a bulky attacker in a lot of ways if you want it to be, but yeah. You also have some like low G stuff you could do with this thing, which of course G power isn't a stat, but I mean, it's there at least. However, there's one Hyper Bakugan that actually does work very, very well. And I'm of course referring to Jagan Dragon. So Jagan Dragon, this thing is crazy because, well, it's pretty good for attack. Again, you got this metal head here, pops up, opens up, you know, decently big. It's meant to kind of, because of the way it opens up, like these wings, the arms, everything goes up, which helps it for attack. It's a pretty good attacker. I don't think it's quite like Gogaryu or Sansu Holobos level. Also, it's technically not above Nino de Shao because Nino de Shao is insane, but I mean, it has some drawbacks to it, so I'd say this thing's more consistent, which is probably more valuable. And also, Windmill. I'd argue Windmill's better than this thing for attack, but Windmill's also, like, really awkward, so it's easier than Windmill, so that's, I guess, a benefit for sure, but, anyway. Also, defensively, you know, the head can drop onto the ground, these wings can drop out, fold out, which makes this thing pretty good for defense. Well, like, decent for defense. Well, yeah, pretty solid, but, occupancy, it's actually, like, really good. It's like a really high tier. Like, it's not like top tier, but it's pretty good. I'd use it over Daifujo or Acro Geyser, but I wouldn't say it's better at occupancy than, like, you know, Yaracha for Nagadasha or, you know, Ozpress, but it's still really good for occupancy. So this thing kind of just does whatever you want it to do, and I think that's why it's such a good Bakugan, and it really kind of puts a lot of other Hyper Bakugan kind of to shame, because it does everything at least a fairly high level, and also you have like good G power, and also Pyrus and Darkness attribute coverage out of this thing, so yeah, this thing kind of does whatever you want, which makes it like really good. Again, you kind of need some of those other Bakugan that are hyper specific to certain stats to really, you know, stand a chance against this thing, because this thing is just insane. But yeah, anyway. So that's kind of just the whole overall summary of BakuTech stats. They didn't work very well in my opinion. I think attack was weird, because on one interpretation, attack is just a whole stat, which is fine, but then you have stand, which just is absolutely pointless, so I opted to just split attack into kind of closed attack and pop-up force, which is kind of awkward, but it's better than the ability to stand on a card being a whole stat, if we're being honest, so I guess there's that. And then defense and occupancy. Defense and occupancy being different stats makes some sense, but I feel like occupancy, getting as crazy as it did, really just negates defense in a lot of ways. So yeah, and then control, I get it, but it's a blind stat. I honestly think they made the right decision to move away from stats in BakuTech Gachi, but I still want to make a video on this just to talk about it, because I feel like it's a very interesting topic, and since they do exist, and like you can hear terms like, you know, pop-out force, attack, defense, occupancy, you know, when talking about BakuTech, I thought it'd be cool to make a video on it and talk about, like, kind of what they are, or at least, well, how I interpret them, and also some of the best Bakugan in that position, and, you know, what makes them good, at least, you know, a brief coverage of that. But anyway, that has been this video on BakuTech stats. Hopefully it was at least, like, somewhat interesting. It's kind of an awkward video to make, because stats are really weird, and I kind of just like disagree with the existence of an entire stat, which is a little bit awkward, but hopefully I may do with what we had here. So anyway, that is this month's, I guess, main BakuTech video, because I've been wanting to do one per month, and the Triathlon video didn't count. This is the main one, so again, hopefully it was at least somewhat interesting to hear about stats. So, well, that's all I gotta say for this video, so yeah. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.